Welcome to the Living Well course. I'm Richard Pyle, I'm from Parkbury House. And the purpose of today but we wanted to do something a bit different because I think the traditional, come along and be lectured to about your 5 a day and not smoking and, eat fewer calories, etc. Let's face it, if that kind of thing worked for everybody, then, none of us would be here. And so this is really exploring the concept of lifestyle medicine. And we've put this together to go over 4 weeks, and it's using our combined expertise as health professionals from different backgrounds. And although we are, 2 of us are doctors at Parkbury House, we're not really here entirely with our GP hats on today. And obviously we're not going to discuss anyone's personal medical history or go into a consultation mode. But the idea is to look at what it means to really live well. And over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be covering various topics, including, well, we'll get onto that in a minute, but essentially we're looking at different topics each week. We're looking at a mix of sort of medicine, behaviour change, bit of physical activity. I would like to stress you, we've designed this to be inclusive and low intensity. We're not making any assumptions about people's levels of physical activity or expertise. If people don't feel able to join in any of the activities or would prefer to do or sit out any bits of it, that's absolutely fine. And we will be recording both this session, just me, not you, and also the physical activity sessions as well, so that if anyone can't make it in future week or enjoys these sessions so much that they want to look at it all over again, then you'll be able to do that, and we'll put the information up there. And the reason we've invited people to come along, and clearly, again, we're not going to get personal or disclose any confidential information here, is because we wanted to offer this course to people who could be at slightly higher risk of developing long-term conditions. And that's been easy for us to do because we can invite our patients from the surgery and we know all about you. We're hoping in the future to do it much more widely across the whole of Hertfordshire and Essex. So we want this to be interactive and not a lecture where you sit and dutifully make notes for 3/4 of an hour trying not to fall asleep. So we're going to start with talking about well-being. So what I'd like you to do, because we've kind of laid this out hopefully to facilitate it, if you could, in groups of say 3 or 4, just for 3 minutes-ish, the 3 questions on the screen for you here. What does well-being mean to you? Because I'm interested in hearing what you've got to say rather than just have me lecture you on what I think it means. What has worked well? What is working well for you at the moment in terms of your well-being? What, even if you're not feeling in such a good place at the moment, what maybe has worked well for you in the past that perhaps you could share with other people and encourage them? And just one thing that you might like to change for the future. So what does well-being mean to you? There are no right or wrong answers, that's fine. What's worked well for you now in the past, and what would you like to change in the future? Do you want to break up into little groups and just for 2 or 3 minutes have a little chat, and then I'll call you back to order in just a minute. Introduce yourselves briefly. Really good conversations. Can I ask you just to wind them up, and just, you can stay kind of in the groups if you want to, just try and turn around so you can see the screen. So that was great how quickly people got stuck into that. Now you're not obliged to, but would anybody like to share from their groups any of the key topics that were brought up there? About, if we started off with, what does well-being mean? Anyone? Well, certainly in the relevant section, I think that's in a couple of weeks' time. That's certainly something we'll talk about as well, because I think there's a lot we've got wrong over the years about talking about diets, and probably including the use of the word diet, I think, to start with. Okay, well, thank you all for sharing that. I've written a few of my own answers down as well. So the question is, how do we define well-being? To be honest, when I started work as a doctor, I was traditionally trained. You go through medical school, you're told there's a particular way of doing things. And well-being, certainly, it was in the 90s when I was training, but well-being was not ever discussed. And I would say it's probably something that's become increasingly discussed in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, perhaps. I remember that David Cameron introduced the idea of a sort of national happiness well-being survey, didn't he? And there are different ways of measuring it all around the world. So well-being, people can't even agree on how to spell it and whether it should be hyphenated, but some things that could be included could be a state of feeling happy or healthy. It's pretty simple, isn't it? And that, it says happy or healthy, so that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have perfect health to be happy and to have a good sense of well-being, but potentially the two can be linked. if you're suffering from extremes, it can be difficult to feel well. Also, there's something about having purpose. You touched on the meaning of life. That's, I think, is that next week or the week after. Anyway, having purpose and feeling in control, I think, is really important. In fact, if I had to say right now up front what I think the two most important pillars of well-being are, I would say it's purpose and meaning, and connection with other people. And I think the other things that we're going to talk about, like sleep and nutrition, etc., are of value. But in some ways, if you don't have the first two, it's very difficult for the others actually to make much of a difference. People have mentioned mental health. I think people think of it as synonymous, the same as having good mental health, and just how we're doing. And also, it's worth remembering sometimes that when we think about well-being, it isn't necessarily just about us individually, but how we're doing collectively as communities, which is something perhaps that we've been thinking a bit more about in the last couple of years. And what determines our well-being? Again, I used to believe that when I was a less experienced doctor, that a patient would come to me, they would have something wrong with them, I would tell them what it was, I would probably fix it or try to fix it, and that would be it. But the reality is that actually our well-being is probably only determined about 20% by what we think of as our health. And we forget sometimes as doctors, we sit in our surgeries and we can become arrogant enough to believe that a person's entire happiness depends upon how well our 10-minute consultation goes and whether they get the right prescription and whether we refer them to the right person. When they've got the whole of the rest of their life going on outside, we only see people as patients sometimes when actually they're people. And at least 3/4, if not more, of what makes them happy, I have no control over, no say over, nothing to do with. But the difficulty is if we don't know where to look and how to support ourselves and each other, then the risk is that we end up thinking, both doctors and patients, that the answer is through medicine, when in reality it isn't, at least not most of the time. And then also there are all these other things outside the consultation room in hospital, etc. Our community, our environment, our social networks. You mentioned the importance of friends, financial issues, really relevant at the moment and increasingly in the next year or two. And what we might term spiritual as well. I'm not pushing any particular philosophy, but the idea about purpose and meaning in life and taking the time to think about what that might be. And the reality is that life is not a level playing field. We know that inequality is one of the greatest drivers of ill health and unhappiness. And it's not just that life isn't a level playing field. We don't all start on the same starting line. I mean, some of us start, 10 yards behind with one arm and one leg tied behind their back. You could argue that I'm a middle-class working white professional, so I've had lots of advantages in life from day one that I've never even had to think about and take for granted. But there is a degree to which, no matter how tough our lives are, we can also look at what control you can take as well as responsibility. So what's lifestyle medicine? Is lifestyle medicine a term that you are familiar with? Getting some nods, I'm getting some shakes. Okay. I would define it, and this is, I think, the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine says evidence-based prevention, treatment and reversal of chronic disease. But it's real medicine, and we're going to go on to look at some data in a minute. But when I first started looking at this about 10 years ago, I kind of imagined that lifestyle medicine sounded a bit woolly. It sounded like maybe it was something that was practiced by people with a lot of facial hair, maybe who grew their own sandals and vegetables, and it was okay. It was nice. Sorry, Rob? Yeah. And it was nice if people wanted to get into it, but it was a bit woo-woo, and it was kind of a little add-on that you bolted onto the real medicine. And in the last 5 years, I've gone 180 degrees round and realised that actually lifestyle medicine is real medicine, and all the other stuff that we bolt on, fancy drugs, fancy tests, procedures, the NHS, etc., that's the stuff that's fiddling with the edges. And I think that's what we've got wrong as a society and why we need to try and rebalance this. And the thing about lifestyle medicine is that it addresses the causes and not the symptoms. If someone comes to me because they're depressed or because they've got diabetes, giving someone pills for either of those things, or even referring them for cognitive behavioural therapy or whatever, it's kind of like putting a sticking plaster on someone's knee when they've bashed it, without showing any curiosity as to why they keep falling over and bashing their knee and what could be done, what they could do to prevent that. And that's why we need to move away from this sickness-based model. The NHS is a national sickness service, and we know at the moment we are all really struggling to do our jobs and to get the care that we need. So it gives us both power and also a degree of responsibility. And ultimately, I think it's the only way out of the mess that we're in as a society and individually. I should stress that I know not everyone likes the term lifestyle medicine. It has been said that it implies that it's saying that everyone's got a choice about where they've ended up. It implies things like fat shaming. It suggests that maybe lifestyle medicine is something that people with time and money and space to think can employ and obsess and look at themselves, etc. But I would argue, whatever the term we end up using, it's something that we can all practice. And so a lifestyle medicine practitioner doesn't need to be a doctor or a nurse. It's something that we can all do for ourselves to some degree. Not running over time too much. So, pillars of well-being, purpose and meaning, connections, sleep, nutrition, movement, stress and relaxation. We're going to talk about all of those things, but I thought I wanted to disappoint you today by not starting talking about fruit and vegetables and however many minutes of exercise you should do a day and a week, because of course you've probably heard all of that before. So we're approaching it in a slightly different way. So this is what I want to just go into a little bit of detail about. Is anyone familiar with the concept of NNT, numbers needed to treat? Getting some nods, some shakes. Okay, so when you read a medical study, it can often be quite difficult to decipher because the jargon that's used, and they'll often say things like, you know, a relative or absolute risk reduction of blah, blah, blah percent, and this was statistically significant or not statistically significant, and was this study powered or underpowered, and what does it mean? And a really nice concept is the numbers needed to treat, which is kind of the so what bit of evidence, which is to say, you've told me about this thing, how many people do I need to treat or need to be treated to get the outcome that you want or to avoid the outcome that you don't want, the numbers needed to treat. There's a great site called the nnt.org, which is run by scientists and statisticians and health professionals who are not in the pay of the pharmaceutical industry and don't have any axe to grind, where they're looking at the data for the interventions that we do in medicine and just how well they work. Now, I try to get people to guess normally, but I've put the numbers up today. So there might be some people in this room, I'm not asking you to stick your hand up, who have been prescribed statins, cholesterol-lowering drugs, by their doctors. And some people might be given that because they've had heart attacks and strokes, and some people might have been given that because they're at risk of having heart attacks and strokes. So this is the NNT for what we call primary prevention. So giving a statin to someone in the hope that they then don't have a heart attack or a stroke. So in order for one person not to have a heart attack or a stroke, you have to give 104 people a statin. In order for them, that's for the heart attack. If you want one person not to have a stroke, you have to give 154 people a statin. The other 153, it will make no difference to them. In the end, a stroke will not be prevented. And in fact, the stroke or the heart attack that the person might have probably won't even be a fatal one. So we're asking a lot of people to take a lot of drugs for a slightly questionable benefit. If I gave you antibiotics for your chest infection, you said, how likely is this to work, doc? And I said, 1 in 100 maybe. You probably wouldn't be all that impressed, and yet we give people statins. There is a thing also called the NNH, numbers needed to harm, because quite rightly people say, hang on a minute, you know, what's the downside of these drugs? And my answer to people on the phone is often, oh, just look in the patient information leaflet, there's a long list. But it's been shown that there is a slightly increased association with diabetes, taking statins, and there is an association with muscle aches and pains that some of you may have heard of or experienced. Well, apparently you only need to give 50 people a statin for one to become diabetic and 10 for one to get muscle problems. So you could argue that the numbers needed to harm are much more significant than numbers needed to treat. Now, for giving people statins if they've had heart attacks or strokes, there's a stronger case, but it's still about 70 or 80 people for someone not to have a further heart attack or a stroke. So I've outlined these top things in red because these are things that we consider modern medicine, good practice, nice guidance, what all doctors should be doing, and yet the evidence is disappointing. I'm slightly risking shooting myself in the foot here, but if you have mildly raised blood pressure, trying to control your mildly raised blood pressure is probably not very likely to result in you not having a heart attack or a stroke. If your blood pressure is more severe, then it will do, but not for mild. And yet we call everyone every year and we give you tablets and ask you to have blood tests, etc. If we then move a bit more into lifestyle, the Mediterranean diet, which has been looked at for physical and mental health benefits, things like olive oil and fish and vegetables and nuts and seeds and some sort of whole grains, etc. If you give 61 people a Mediterranean diet, one of them will not have a heart attack, a stroke, or die, and that NNT is actually therefore better than the statins that your doctor prescribes. For every 7 people who lose weight, 1 will not develop diabetes. For every 13 who lose weight, 1 will not develop blood pressure. For every 14 people who lose weight, they will avoid lifelong disability. Those are amazing numbers needed to treat, and yet that doesn't involve a drug company, it doesn't involve a prescription. It's something that is entirely within the reach of everybody in this room. The Mediterranean diet for depression, mental health was mentioned. The SMILES trial in Australia showed that if 4 people who were moderately to severely depressed on drugs, seeing doctors, so this is not mild feeling a bit down in the dumps, this was proper depression, for every 4 people that had a modified Mediterranean diet added in, 1 of them recovered from their depression compared to the others who didn't. And you may have heard of the intensive low-calorie diets now for trying to cure or prevent diabetes, type 2 diabetes. They're quite drastic. It's 800 calories a day. They're not a long-term option, but they are recommended on the NHS for certain people. And if you've had long-term diabetes, just 2 people need to go on that to cure their diabetes. And in fact, just if you've been newly diagnosed, it's pretty much 1-to-1. Pretty much every single person who managed to stick with an intensive low-calorie diet would have their newly diagnosed diabetes cured. So the drugs, it's a bit of a sensationalist headline. The drugs do work a bit, and I know that there'll be people here or relatives that who've had their lives saved through treatment for cancer, treatment on ITU for sepsis, dramatic interventions, a hip replacement which improved your quality of life. But a lot of the things that we think of as medicine as doctors, the evidence actually isn't there, but it's what we've always been told to do. So, one time. So the question is, if there are changes that you'd like to make, and people have given 1 or 2 examples of what they'd like to do, the question is, how do we do it? Because if it was easy, then I wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be here. And a lot of people know the what. They've got the information. Everyone knows that you shouldn't smoke and shouldn't drink too much and should probably go for a walk every day. People might even know the why, in terms of why it's a good idea to do those things. But the question is the how. You gave the example of getting up every day thinking about not eating and then ending up eating. So the key is it's the behaviour change. It's the why and particularly the how that's really important. And change is inevitable. It's a part of life. Darwin's theory of evolution was about it wasn't the fittest who survived, it was the most adaptable. So that we do all face challenges, and obviously we've all faced a lot of challenges recently. And those who adapt are the ones that will survive. And we know that willpower is not enough. Saying, I will do this, I won't do this today. Again, if it worked for people, it wouldn't be a problem. So the facts are not enough, just willpower is not enough. So the question is what people find helpful to make changes. One of the things is our environment. And again, this is the interesting debate people have. Am I as I am because of the way that things have happened to me in life, the family I was born into, the education I received, the place that I live, the things that happened to me in childhood, etc. And the answer is yes, to a significant degree, that those things have shaped us very strongly as to how we are. But the question is, well, now, if we believe that environment can create those issues and make us the people that we are, then surely if we change our environments, that can potentially mean that we then also change. And we are actually, as human beings, we're a collection of habits. Have you heard of the gut microbiome? So the microbiome, getting a few nods, it's the idea that there's a whole other sort of us which lives inside our gut, and that's responsible for lots of things, including our immune system. And if you count up the number of cells in your body, actually there are more cells in me that aren't me, if you see what I mean. There are microorganisms that live in me and on me, rather than actually cells that are Richard. So all those things make me the person that I am, and our habits make us the person that we are. And people can sometimes feel, oh, I can't change that now. It's just too difficult. All these things have gone on in my life. I feel stuck. And yeah, even just starting to change one habit at a time, by definition, if you have success, then you begin to think of yourself in a different way. And the person who's done one thing can do another thing and another thing. And often people find that they then enjoy those successes and they want to build on them and do more and more. So habits can be hard to shift, but just by changing 1 or 2 of them, they can change the people that we are. And life is is complicated, and so are we. And I talk to lots of people who have tried to make changes, and maybe those changes haven't worked, and they've become disheartened as a result. I tried swimming, I tried running, I tried going for a bike ride, or eating, smoking less, or eating these types of food, and for whatever reason, it didn't work for me. But that's not to say that it can't be achieved either by trying it again in a different way or doing something else differently. And the other problem that we have sometimes with behavior change is that as humans, we instinctively do this, and I think we all learn this as we get a bit older, though, that it's wrong. But we believe that past performance predicts the future. So someone in their 20s, they tend to think they're immortal, don't they? They're going to live forever. Nothing's gone wrong yet, mostly. No bits have fallen off unless you've been unlucky. And you carry that with you. And people who are 80 go, I feel like I'm still 18. Well, they're obviously not, but they feel like that. And then when we get into our 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, and we begin, the things that we took for granted begin to become a bit more difficult. But often when we're younger, we don't think about that. We assume we're going to live forever. We assume we can carry on doing what we've done forever. But life becomes a bit less forgiving as we get older. Also, we're not very good at delayed gratification. If I see a nice slice of, I had a beautiful cake brought to surgery yesterday, which very sadly I dropped on the floor spectacularly, and the whole thing ended up in this ugly, messy heap, which I'm pleased to say our reception staff are eating this morning. They decided it was still good enough to eat. But when I looked at that lovely slice of cake yesterday, I did have a lovely slice of cake because I was hungry, and I'd been good all day, so that was fine, although I shouldn't be using the word good. But we often don't do delayed gratification. We don't. I didn't say to myself, Richard, what will your 70-year-old self thank you for if you eat this cake today? Would it thank you for eating the cake, or would I not want me to eat the cake? And often, if we have an option in front of us, we just want to go for it. We want to go for the thing in the moment that makes us feel good and gives us an immediate reward, whether it's a dopamine hit for ticking something on social media or for enjoying something that we like. I'm not saying it's wrong to enjoy things in the moment, but that is sometimes another problem because we don't make the best decisions for ourselves in the moment. And not everyone's ready to change. I don't know if you're familiar with the cycle of change, the idea that, let's take smoking, for example, the idea that someone is sort of happy smoking, not entirely happy smoking, thinking about maybe quitting smoking, actively trying to quit smoking, succeeding in quitting smoking or not succeeding, and then going round again. And people are in the different parts of the cycle of change for their life for many different reasons. It could be what you're eating, it could be your levels of physical activity, it could be drugs or alcohol, or problems with relationships, and not everyone's ready to change at the same time, which is fine. We also tend to overcomplicate things, I think, as well. I've seen a lot of people who've said, I don't just want to change one thing, I want to change 12 things. Here are my 12 things I'm going to change. And the problem with that, and you meet very rare individuals who can do that. I used to have one GP who I did his appraisal every year, and he always produced 12 different things he was going to do. Every year without fail, he ticked them all off. But he was a freak. He was a one-off. If you overcomplicate things, the risk is that one or more of those things you will not achieve, which in turn could then make you feel a bit downhearted, which in turn might then you might think, well, is it really worth it? Oh, I failed again. So I think when it comes to the principles of change, it's best to keep it simple, which is why I suggested at the beginning that maybe just try one thing. But ultimately, if you do want a better life or a different life, you need a plan. I don't know if you're like me, but unless I put things in the diary, whether it's social events or work meetings or things I want to achieve, unless I put them in the diary, unless I make a plan, they just don't happen. And I think life is like that. Otherwise, every day, at the back of your mind, you can say, I wish it was different. I'd like to do something differently. But without a plan, it's relatively unlikely you're going to get there. So what's the secret source of success? So it's important understanding what matters to us. A friend of mine who's also a GP at the surgery says to people often, not what's the matter with you, but what matters to you. What are, going back to the meaning and purpose thing, what is it that really motivates you in life? Never mind other people lecturing you about what you should and shouldn't be doing, but actually what are the goals that you would like to achieve? And that's where we talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So we know that in the long term, intrinsic motivation, a reason from inside you to do something that you want to do, you're more likely to succeed if you're doing that, rather than extrinsic motivation, where someone has said to me, Richard, you need to lose £6 or not drink alcohol during the week or stop smoking or whatever. Intrinsic goals that are related to meaningful activities, wanting to play football with your grandkids or being able to ride a bike again or achieve a project you've always wanted to achieve. Intrinsic motivation is you're more likely to succeed. And having a plan, I mentioned, being specific is good. It's people will say things like, "It's New Year's Eve. Right, what am I going to do for my New Year's resolution? I will drink less. I will lose weight. I will be nicer to other people." The question is, how do you know? What's your plan for doing that, and how are you going to measure it? How will you ever know? And there's a concept in a book called Think Small, talking about how little changes lead to big results. And the concept is of bright lines. If you want to do something, this isn't always possible, but if you want to do something, it's ideal to set yourself a goal, something that you can measure. And at the end of the day, you can say, I have done that, or I haven't done that. So it could be, I will not drink alcohol during the week. Either you achieve that or you don't. And whereas counting calories might be a bit trickier. And being specific about the plan is helpful, because then what you can do is you can break it down. So you might say, this is my goal. I want to be doing couch to 5K. But then the question will be, well, how do you start that? Well, I'll probably need to download the app onto my phone, and then I might have a chat with some friends about how it works, maybe look at joining a group that's doing it. And then there are little things I'll need to do each day to make it successful. And if you break these down into small steps, then they're more likely to be achievable. And these changes should be sustainable and rational and relevant. They should be something that you want to do. Some people say, oh, I want to get fitter, so I'm going to choose this activity. And then it turns out that they don't like that activity, that they really hate it. Have you ever seen those people running around the park, dragging tyres and being shouted at by people in military gear? I mean, I'm sure that ticks some people's boxes, but it wouldn't do it for me. And I wouldn't consider it particularly rational or relevant. But taking my dog for a run is rational and relevant, because he gets a walk and I get the activity at the same time. And then accountability is important as well. So we know from the principles of behaviour change that if you tell someone about what you intend to do, you're more likely to do it. Because particularly if you actually say to them, I would like you to ask me every week how that's going. I'm going to appoint you to be a referee. Now, sometimes I say to people, you might want to pick your spouse if you should have a spouse. That could be a bit of a double-edged sword. I think there are some things I wouldn't tell my wife I'm trying to do just because I don't want her nagging me, but other people might find that really helpful. And it could be just someone that who's just going to check in with you every week and ask how it's gone. Think about rewards as well. How are you going to reward yourself? Some people like their favourite box sets when they're on the treadmill or if they've gone to the gym. Some people might say the money that I don't spend on alcohol or cigarettes, I will put in a box and I'll save up for something else that I really do want, or put it towards a holiday, or looking forward to the dress I'm going to buy for the wedding. And then the pre-mortem is quite important as well. So without wishing to appear pessimistic, thinking about what could go wrong. This is my goal. These are the bits that I'd like to do that I've broken it down into. Where might each of those go wrong? I'm going to start cycling to work every morning. What might happen there? Well, I could get, the weather might be bad, so I might not cycle because it's a bit rainy, or I might get a puncture, or my bike might need servicing, or there are some days when I can't cycle to work because I'm going to have to do something else in the middle of the day that needs the car. So thinking about all the things where it could go wrong and planning to get around those as best you can be really helpful as well. And treating failure as a friend. Perhaps failure is too strong a word. People will say, oh, I tried that and it didn't work, and you can beat yourself up about it as a result. But actually, don't think of it as a personal failure. Think of it as your system that you designed didn't quite work out, this experiment, this plan that you had. But there are ways that you could come up with a new improved version instead, rather than writing it off completely. And the last thing I think is about being kind to ourselves. If you can't be kind to yourself, you can't be kind to other people. And learning from failure is important. So that's my whistle-stop tour through what's about behaviour change. So we've spoken about well-being. What is it? What works well for me? What might I like to change? And then we talked about the principles of how it could change. So I'm going to invite you for the next, let's give it 10 minutes. I think we've got time for that. To think about, going back to our conversation right at the beginning, is there one goal that you would like to achieve? Now, we're going to be going into more depth in specific areas over the next few weeks, and you may change your goal each week, that's fine. But just at this stage, in any area, think about, is there one goal that you would like to achieve? What are the simple steps that you might need to take to achieve it? Are there things that could get in the way? And who could support you and hold you accountable, whether it's the social group that was mentioned at the beginning, or a friend or a partner or whatever, a colleague. And how will you know if you've achieved it, this goal that you want to achieve? So what I invite you to do is to get back into your groups, and if you want to, you're welcome to use any paper that you've got. We can let you have a copy of the spare paper on the back table if you want to, and just each in turn, just if you feel comfortable to, just share that together for about the next 5-10 minutes, and then I'll give you a shout at the end, and we'll get Raoul and his colleagues in, and we'll leave that on the screen so you can remind yourselves.